Hi Booktube, it's Roz. It's the end of the month of People April, the readathon that I hosted with Elisabeth of Bouquins of Books. It was her wonderful idea, and it's been all about reading books about people, but in this video I wanted to do a little kind of wrap-up review about the group read, the People April group read, and which was The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out some of the things that people talked about in the Voxer discussion group that we had for the group read. And that means that I'll do a little bit more kind of like looking down and reading than usual, because I've actually kind of picked up some of the things that, as I say, other people other than me said about the book. So I'm just going to start by saying hi to Elisabeth, of course, but also Tilly and Alba and Magda and Anne and Jolene and Sandy and Greg and Kate, who started out with us and then stopped because she realised the subject matter of the book was not the thing she needed to read at the moment, and to Amelia, who read the book back in 2020 but enjoyed it so much that she wanted to be part of the discussion, and which was brilliant. So hi all of you, and I hope I do our conversation justice. So Rubenhold is a social historian, and she draws on primary and secondary sources, so original records and so on, but also what other historians have written, to try and tell us what she can about the lives of these five women, about Polly and Annie and Elisabeth and Kate and Mary Jane, and I suppose to try and debunk some of the assumptions that were made about them at the time, and that certainly had an impact on the effectiveness of the police investigation into their killing by someone that is now referred to as Jack the Ripper, but who was never found, never identified. A number of us, I think, were impressed about how Rubenhold how much she manages to put together about the lives of these women, bearing in mind the limitations of the records that she's working from. Magda said, it's incredible how Rubenhold managed to retrieve so much about these women from the few scattered marks they left in history. Because, of course, unless you're, a queen or a countess or a notable author or whatever, there can actually be very little to that's sort of left behind of your life once you're gone. But she really sort of scrapes up and finds everything that she can. Now, both Alba and Tilly talk about the potential risk that historians and biographers, when they're working with sort of limited sources, can tend to kind of speculate instead, and in particular the way biographers have a tendency to pretend that they know how the people that they're writing about thought and felt, when there's no way really that you could they can do that, unless they've got letters, say, to draw on, or journals, which absolutely very little of that sort of thing that Rubenhold could draw on for these women. But as Tilly said, unlike other books I've read, I really did feel she was basing her words on the best available information, and where she was speculating about one of the women's emotions, for instance, it was always clear that was what she was doing, and I think we really appreciated that. And these women had actually surprisingly varied lives. They had jobs and they had families and they had homes. Maybe they lost them, but yes, not just the fact that they wound up on the streets of Whitechapel and thus vulnerable to the serial killer doesn't mean that that's how they spent their whole lives. And many of us picked out how much we appreciated and enjoyed the level of detail that Rubenhold sort of brings to the book. You know, we learned about the kind of, well, if one of the women had a particular kind of job, we'd get detail about how that industry or that, you know, form of work, you know, if it was the tin plating industry in the Midlands, or if it was, you know, what it was like being different kinds of servants, say, or, you know, one's married to a coachman, and you know, what was the position of coachmen in within the sort of levels of household servant. You know, they were sort of better off and had more autonomy than others. Or what was it like to be a char or a maid of all work or a scullery maid? What was it like to write chapbooks, you know, and produce, you know, little relatively instant and printed publications with songs and ballads and stories of hangings and, you know, all sorts of different kind of like real fine detail. Elisabeth picked out on that, picked particularly about how the author explains the various places an ordinary family could live in those times, and she noticed that, you know, a whole family might be living in one room of a similar size to the room that Elisabeth was sitting in as she was reading the book and talking about the book. You know, that there could be 6 or 8 people in that same space. So it, you know, it really brings Victorian society to life really well, to have that level of detail. As Greg said, you know, the book has a kind of a really vivid description of absolute poverty that some people ended up in, but it isn't only that isn't the only bit that gets vividly described. I guess, you know, we get a bit of a range, although they all ended up, you know, all but one sort of literally sleeping out on the streets on the night that they were killed, and so, you know, at the absolutely at the bottom of the pile. We were all struck by how little it might take for someone to go from kind of doing okay, you know, maybe even doing quite well, you know, being, you know, comfortable, not well off perhaps, but comfortable, or at least securely housed and employed, to, yes, the kind of absolute poverty that Greg was mentioning. Anne put it really well. She said, you know, how precarious life was for the poor in Victorian times. And, you know, as she says, it didn't take much for a whole family to end up in the workhouse. You know, a death, a loss of job, you know, a period of perhaps mental ill health or physical ill health, and that could be it. Magda remarks on the compassionate approach of the author to the 5 women, and you know, that really contrasts in the book with the really lurid way that the press of the time wrote about these women, depicted them, and I think that obviously had an influence also on the police investigation. But, you know, it's kind of what you need to sell newspapers, but it was pretty brutal. We all noted the really striking impact of alcohol on all these women, in fact, and that perhaps, you know, more than we'd anticipated, that was, you know, a common factor, in fact, I think for all of them, you know, ending up where they did. You know, it was something that, you know, people turned to escape from pain, or, you know, mental pain or sadness, but all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, became trapped by that, to a place where they would perhaps prioritise getting more to drink to getting the cost of a safe bed for the night. Jolene was talking about how one of the women, Annie, and how she found, I'll quote Jolene, found her story quite compelling, not just her own alcoholism, but how it affected her entire family. And you know, if the woman in the family, you know, if a mother, you know, became alcoholic, you know, the knock-on effects of that for those around her. But Alba said, you know, it would have been a miracle if she hadn't turned to alcohol, you know, given the tragedies that she faced. And again, one of the things that the book really brought home, I think, it was the reality for poor parents of the high levels of infant mortality, you know, and the, you know, what that did to families and their, you know, mental and emotional well-being. Everyone in the group, I think, is someone who reads at least a certain amount of Victorian literature, and we're all, you know, at least moderately well informed about Victorian history and so on. But I think we all felt that we learned loads from reading this book. You know, as Elisabeth remarked, you know, if you're a Victorian novelist writing in Victorian times, there's lots of things that you just assume that people know that we don't anymore. And so, you know, reading something like this kind of fills in lots of the gaps. You know, I would have had no idea that, I don't know, how a Swedish farmer's daughter could have wound up running a coffee house in London and then, you know, ultimately end up spending the night on the streets. What were our overall impressions? Alba's was a respect for Rubenhold's ability to evoke the milieu of these women's lives. That's how she put it. And I really share, Alba's sort of respect, as she says there. Magda's remark was about the stunning visual and also auditory and olfactory imagery that reconstruct important but neglected parts of Victorian England. But Magda also remarked about how reading it, you know, it was a really gripping story in the way that it was written. And as I say, I think an important kind of benefit from reading the book that several of us felt was how it will add to our future reading of Victorian novels, Victorian literature in general. You know, Tilly said, my understanding of Victorian literature will be greatly enhanced. And, you know, I really felt the same. And so that was a benefit for us. But I'm going to give the final word to Amelia about what the book meant for her, but also for Polly and Annie and Elisabeth and Kate and Mary Jane. Because Amelia said, I thought, finally someone did these women justice. And yeah, I think that's a fair comment. So thank you so much for everyone who took part in the group read. If you were reading the book but not part of the Voxer group, do please come and add your voice in the comments and roll on next year's People April.